Okay, so I'll introduce the first keynote for this block. Guillaume Dumas is an associate professor of computational psychiatry in the Faculty of Medicine at the Université de Montréal and the principal investigator of the Precision Psychiatry and Social Physiology Laboratory. Professor Dumas uses AI and machine learning to study mental health by creating new algorithms to investigate the development of human cognitive architecture and to deliver personalized medicine and neuropsychiatry using data ranging from the genome to smartphones. Furthermore, he studies social neurosciences via AI and machine learning by translating basic brain research and dynamical systems formalism into neurocomputational and machine learning hybrid models, as well as machines with social learning ability. So we're very excited to have you here today with us, Professor Dumas. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Real pleasure to be here and to share some of the past and present work in our team. So today, it's the combination of neuroscience and artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I will start by the grounding into the neuroscience and then move to the social neuro-AI aspects. So first, I want to thank the organizer and all my team, the Precision Psychiatry and Social Physiology team that is actively covering both neuroscience and AI. And thanks to them, we are making progress at this interface. So the team is really in a children's hospital at Saint-Justine, but we are also affiliated to Mila. And on top of the more computational psychiatry and precision medicine, we are actively working on this very topic of social neuro-AI, so the convergence of social neuroscience and artificial intelligence. So the beginning is social physiology. So social physiology is a term that I used to give homage to Claude Bernard. Maybe you know Claude Bernard. He was a French scientist and one of the first system biologists. And he coined the term homeostasis and have a perspective, a holistic perspective on medicine. And physiology is the science of those function and how the body should be taken as a whole system and not like a series of chunk of meat. So social physiology try to make the sense that social cognition is not just something that happened in the air, nor something that happened in a specific brain area, but we have to take a holistic perspective and multi-scale approach. And it started through the very strange, now it's feeling even more strange because like people now are accepting that, paradox that the social brain and social cognition had mostly been studied in the history of neuroscience from a single brain and isolated individual perspective. And if we want to really truly understand what makes us social, we are probably the most social species on Earth. We have to study at least two individuals engaged in a dynamic interaction. And 10 years ago, it was not clearly the case. Some people even call social interaction the dark matter of neuroscience metaphorically, because there were no such thing as dual recording of brain activity during social interaction. And so in the last 10 years, that was about that. Like my program was about trying to dig into this dark spot of the literature and have experimental and theoretical account of what makes us social and what are the underlying mechanisms that allow this fit in human cognition. And so we use experimental techniques, especially one called hyperscanning that allow the recording of two or more people simultaneously. We use computational modeling with the first simulation of in silico social interaction with biophysical models. So two brains interacting in a vat. So taking like the brain in a vat, but adding a social dimension to it. And since I'm a nerd, I like the Venn diagram. So at the intersection between experiment and model, something that initially we called human dynamic clamp because it was the main project, but now we can expand that as human-machine interaction and trying to make the experimental work on humans and the modeling work in machine combined. So the early steps were, I'm sorry for those who've seen these videos so many times, but I take comfort in saying like I've seen those videos during 11 months doing a frame by frame analysis at that time. So so during my PhD, I designed a hyperscanning EEG system to record two brains while people were engaged in active real-time social interaction. And through the recording of their brain activity and jointly their video of interaction, and at that time, again, there were no computer vision at this level of precedence, so there was no deep lab cut and so on. So I had to do it by hand. We were able to map what are the neural correlates at the intra and interpersonal level of real-time interaction. And since we have only 30 minutes, I will cut straight to the most interesting part. So this allowed to identify for the first time like purely endogenous emergence of interbrain synchronization only driven by the interaction itself without an external metronome or entrainment by an external stimulus. So it was just like by having the two people mutually anticipating each other behavior that their brain activity get entrained at tight level of interaction. And at the time it was like pretty hard to get it out. It's like I think more than 10 desk review, desk rejection, and the paper was very hard to publish. But as you see, like now there's a very large interest in multi-brain neuroscience and how to make more ecological recording of human cognition. And I put the 1965 because it's a funny anecdote, since the first dual brain recording actually was published in Science in 1965. The abstract is one sentence, and the only figure is just a photograph of EEG traces of two twins, and they were pretending to have demonstrated telepathy. So I guess like these 30 years of nothingness is kind of a failed replicability crisis of hyperscanning before even hyperscanning was something. Anyway, so in 2010 we published that, and now 2020 we are reaching like 100 papers per year. And to help build this community, we have initiated development of a software package to standardize and have a good community of practice at statistical, preprocessing, and visualization level. We have also, with colleagues, for instance, in philosophy, tried to disentangle the different factors that may be at play in those phenomenon, because when we are measuring multiple brain simultaneously, we are recording also spurious phenomena, such as like common drive by the environment or shared cultural background. And so those like are intertwined in a way that is not compatible with the strictly reductionist way of looking at things in cognitive neuroscience, because the way you are similar or not with another impact the way you communicate, but the way you communicate also shape back what you are and what we are with others. So typically, for instance, I will dwell into that a bit. In the construction of human bonding, whether during development or during a therapeutic alliance with a clinician, these are bidirectional processes. With Quentin Moreau, you have seen maybe already, it's part of the organization. We also try to chart a bit what are the potential explanation and way to define the causal relationship that we are dealing with regarding those interbrain synchronization. So typically, people have argued that we need only to use stimulation to assess causality. But in this letter in Transit Cognitive Science, we show that there are different levels of explanation following Craver, Explaining the Brain, very good book. So the direct causation, the structural causation, and the logical causation. And typically the logical causation gonna be a bridge for jumping to AI through computational modeling. But just before jumping to the AI part, so as illustration, those are like the uncharted territory that we are trying to explore right now. Hyperscanning in clinical contexts, and typically understanding what make a therapeutic alliance work. So why certain clinician and patients match in their dynamics and in the therapeutic process, and when sometimes it doesn't work, and to what extent we can, for instance, assess how telemedicine and the fact that after the pandemic, and even in Quebec with the people in the north that are isolated, how mediating through technology this process of therapeutic alliance is different than face-to-face. So if you're interested in all that, there is like a short piece that I wrote for the perspective in interpersonal psychiatry, and let's jump to social neuro-AI now. So as I say, like the third approach for logico-deductive causality demonstration, so like the more logic part of explanation, you can use no brain hyperscanning, so pure simulated brains in silico. And at that time, it was the first burst of interest in connectomics. I don't know if Yasser, Victoria, or people working with Yasser, Victoria are there, but at that time, I didn't know Yasser. He was in Cuba, I think, and we had exchange. He gave me like one of the first connectome they designed, and I used that to create not one brain, but copy paste 2 brains, and so 2 brains for the price of 1, and simulated the sensory motor loop between the motor area of one brain and the visual area of the other brain, and vice versa, reproducing what I showed you earlier with the spontaneous imitation of end movements in people during experimental recordings. And here the question was first, because we observed that, we had to demonstrate it in several ways, even to convince reviewers, but we had no clue exactly about the mechanisms underlying those facts, this phenomenon of synchronization. Of course, like one of the first mechanisms that we can study is the impact of anatomy, and to what extent sharing the same anatomy would facilitate interbrain synchronization. And so, yeah, that's a short version of the talks. If you want more information, of course, there is the paper. But the long story short, it's the case. Like having the anatomy that have been shaped through evolution, the human connectome, potentiates our coupling with others. And if you start altering this connectome, you lose this propensity to coordinate. And so like that has some consequences, for instance, in the way we can approach neurodiversity, and our variation of the connectomes can imply a lack of ability to get in sync with others, and typically during development could lead to alteration of social cognition, such as autism. So the other step that was done after like this purely generative model, so moving from social generative model to social interactive model, during postdoc, I worked with Scott Kelso, who developed dynamical systems approach of understanding motor behavior initially, and then social behavior later on. And inspired by electrophysiologists who have what's called the dynamic clamp. So it's like a patch clamp, but where you can both stimulate and record. And using those nonlinearity, you can study things like thalamocortical loop, for instance, that you cannot only study in cortical slice if you don't have this feedback loop. And here we took inspiration from electrophysiologists and did that with a human and behavior. So like having not only unidirectional recording of the behavior, but actually in real time. So when I say real time, it was programmed in C++ to have like 500 hertz ordinary differential equation running. And so like we had a human coupled with a dynamical system in real time while we were recording their brain activity. And here you can test the human. So compared to hyperscanning recording, we keep this dynamical aspect of sensory motor loop between two agents, but you control half of the dyad. So it's very cool for testing social cognitive phenomenon in interactive context. So to test the human brain, but you can also test the model. So if the model is able to fake to be a human, so like what some people call the Turing test, but here in a nonverbal way, then it showed that the model is capturing something very interesting at the behavioral level. But here in the paper, we even argue that such test, the Turing test, should also take into account the underlying implementation of the model. So like it's not about just fooling the judge, the human, but also being aligned with what we understand about electrophysiology and the underlying mechanism in the brain. So that's kind of the Neuro-AI also perspective. And finally, so inspired by this human dynamic clamp, I deployed that in a clinical context at the hospital in Paris. And we started to investigate how children with different disorders, especially autism disorder, were assessed during this interactive task. So using this paradigm of having a real-time coupling with a model, we use that to assess interactive skills of kids. And finally, kids are already direct, but autistic kids are even more direct. So they immediately told me that this finger wiggling on the screen was pretty bad video game. And I even like censor a bit sometimes. So we tried to gamify it initially in 2D. And more recently, we switched to even mixed reality, which is like a new technology combining the realism of virtual reality and the immersion of it, but with holographic technology. So you're not cut from the real world. It's like a overlay on what you see in the world. So this is like a artistic view. I have also a video I can show later. But so the thing is that the kid is popping balloons in the room, virtual balloons. And the clinician or the parents can share. So it's an intersubjective concept with mixed reality. So the balloon appear at the same place for all the people that have the helmet. It's not like Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go, you see a Pokemon, but your partner may not see the Pokemon at the exact same place and so on. Here it's like all synchronized. But you can alter in the software who see what. So like, for instance, the clinician can see if the kid is stressed, what is the physiological readout of the behavior, what are the reaction time and so on. And once the kid is done popping balloons, we can collect a large amount of data at the behavioral level, but also with, thanks for instance, with the new HoloLens helmet, the HoloLens 2, we can have even eye tracking. So where the kid is looking at, which is very informative in conditions such as autism. And for now, we tried without the eye tracking and the heartbeat, only just the behavior, the playing behavior, reaction time, and movements. And we achieved pretty high quality reconstruction of the identity of the participants. So just based on the behavior, we are able to retrieve who was the player in a database. And the plan was to make a proof of concept to move to a clinical population with sufficient large amount of data in neurotypical population and different types of condition to reconstruct developmental trajectories and assess profiles based on those trajectories to make stratification and define subgroups. So like really the precision psychiatry part of the lab. And we are doing that also with genetics, but here the interesting part is that since it's a video game, you can deploy it at scale, very fast, even in the north of Quebec. And basically sometimes behavior give also larger effect size than genetics. So the Neuro-AI per se, so that was 2 years ago now when I arrived in Montreal and with Mila, and we started working on a research axis with Mila. And thanks to the intern of Samuel Bolota at the time, we wrote this piece, kind of a roadmap for social neuro-AI, where we saw 3 main axes. One associated with temporal dynamics, because from a social neuroscience perspective, a lot of the things and brain structure implicated in social cognition are also brain structure associated with temporal attention and management of time. And unfortunately, current machine learning architecture are not that good in dynamics. They are pretty feed-forward and discrete. So there are new architectures such as Neural ODE, GokuNet, and so on that integrate differential equation in the implementation. And so that's the kind of thing we are heading towards. The second axis is biological plausibility, and this is typically where the Neuro-AI come from. So pushing even further what deep learning has already brought, like the giving tree of the brain has not given all the fruits yet. So we have understood that there is like hierarchical aspect. We understood, like, for instance, convolution, but there are way more things in the brain that have not been exploited yet. Typically astrocytes, oscillations, many other stuff. But so, and neurotransmitters, for instance, and not only dopamine, but a lot of neurotransmitters are even not yet very understood at the neuroscientific level. And the third axis is the social embodiment, and we're gonna dive into it, I think, with the next talks. A lot of people are talking about GPT and ChatGPT and so on. We're still at the chatbot level. How we get to a more embodied agent through 2D and 3D games. So I'm collaborating with video game industry for that. Extended reality with mixed reality and HoloLens, and potentially even robots at some point. And so to give you some highlights, so for instance, regarding dynamical systems theory and how it can be useful for machine learning, there's like this wonderful survey by Matap Anahani. I don't know if she's there. We spent a lot of time on those figures, so enjoy. But it was like trying to make a good chart of all the conceptual scope that we are dealing when we're talking about modeling and from dynamical system perspective, from a machine learning perspective, from a neuroscience perspective, and so on. We ended up having the Mars level pretty much matching with what we describe. I'm not a big fan of Mars level because people tend to reify those levels as a level that you cannot cross, and I think nature doesn't care about levels. I mean, we are projecting that, but it can be useful at least to understand what we are talking about. This is an application with German Abrevaya, where combining deep learning and differential equations, we are able to outsmart predictive ability of vanilla deep learning or just computational modeling of the brain. So taking the best of the two worlds and putting the known unknowns in the model and the unknown knowns, to cite Rumfeld. And another way of also jumping between levels is to have a biophysical approach. So I'm not necessarily saying that we should get into the Markram approach of simulating everything, but biophysical is anchored in empirical data and typically in the molecular level. And collaborating with Jean-Pierre Changeux on that, he reminds all the time like how the molecular level has been deeply undermined in computer science and AI. And here what we try is to take only the necessary condition to achieve conscious access in Drosophila and animal model, and in human also. So we are not talking about consciousness in the sense of phenomenal consciousness and so on. We are talking about access consciousness, so the ability of reportability. And through these different levels, we show that ascending neuromodulation, so spontaneous activity, dopamine and reinforcement learning, and interneuron, so having the ability of having inhibitory activity, those three things are necessary if you want to achieve reportability in spiking neural network. So that's ongoing work. And if we abstract, so using exactly this diagram here, so if we take more like the abstract pure sense, we can go to deep learning and use deep learning more as a sandbox for testing cognitive architecture and our understanding of cognitive architecture. So in that case, what we are trying to do with Diambo Liu at Mila in collaboration with Samuele Bolota, Mike Zhu, and Yoshua Bengio is to seek an implementation of the attention schema theory of Michael Graziano. Maybe some of you saw his talk at last May. So Michael Graziano published 2 years ago in a PNAS attention schema agent, but implementing the attention schema hardwired. And here, what we're trying to do is to have plasticity and add the agent learn attention schema, which happened to be more difficult than expected, as usual. But that's where you get your dirty that you learn stuff. So, and the plan is to test this attention schema in multi-agent reinforcement learning setting. Yeah. Right. And because one of the prediction of attention schema theory, and I love this part, is that from an evolutionary standpoint, we had more advantages in the first place to predict other behavior than our own behavior. And so actually social cognition came first. And so it's true, having developed the underlying mechanism at the biological level in the brain to better predict behavior of other conspecifics, and applying those same mechanism to our own behavior, that self-awareness come into play. So it's a very cool reversal of the problem. I like it. And so we are testing it. So we are testing how through attention schema in multi-agent setting, we're gonna have plasticity that will allow a self-referential learning of the agent. And so there is like a preliminary archive paper that we just released this week. It's preliminary, but at least I would love to see feedback if you have. There's like maybe the most on the edge stuff that we are doing in the lab, I think. And introducing the next speaker, I think, Amin, I don't know if he's the next or the third one, but we can use also deep learning models to test social theory. And in this work, I was not directly implicated in this one, but I'm now in the group and trying to participate in the Mind Jazz. They try to understand mathematically how we can abstract agents. So like when you have 2 agents, maybe you simulate 2 agents, but when you have 10,000 agents, like a hand colony, it's maybe more parsimonious to simulate the ant colony as one agent than all the individual ants. And so where you situate your level of abstraction about modeling others, maybe account for this complexity and abstraction of agents. And so here, for instance, if you have 2 agents, A1 and A2, with 2 types of action patterns, if their actions are totally correlated compared to the case in green on the right, maybe you can compress the representation of their action policy more than individuals that are very, very disconnected in their behavior. So they apply that to the diplomacy game. Now apparently AI are better than us at diplomacy, so it's not, they are not implicated in that, but yeah. And to finish, so a last thing that is important, I think, I wrote more and worked more on the medicine and AI, but I think it's applied to also neuroscience and AI. that, so we wrote these comments from machine learning to student learning to say that training AI at the interface with other disciplines is not just a technical challenge, but it's also an epistemic challenge. And we need to teach not only the technicalities, but also the histories of science and the philosophy background of what we are dealing with. I think we will avoid a lot of cringe on Twitter if people read more philosophy. And it's also an institutional challenge because we are living with silos of department, faculties, and so on. And to be able to have fruitful neuro-AI growth, we need to break those silos at some point. So one attempt to break a silo with my colleague Michael Chassé in intensive care unit is the first course in French about computational medicine. You can still register, I guess, for next fall. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Do we have any questions for Professor Dumas? Yeah, feel free to head to the mic.
So I had a question about your work on like the social connectome in a sense, right? Where you said you used one of the first connectomes to kind of in these for dynamical modeling, right, of social interaction. And you said like it performed better than, I don't know, a randomized network. And like, what was the benchmark or like, and did you get into like maybe specific from like a network science perspective, specific, I don't know, architectural features that underlie this?
I know that you're asking this question. We're gonna use actually some of the method that you use, I think. Nice. So at that time, 2012, we ran a null model for degrees, and I control also for clustering, but not for small worldness. And apparently, small worldness was part of the thing. So now another aspect may be more about the modularity, because the motor region and the visual region are embedded at certain place in space. So it's not like just a free scale or a small world network. The human connectome has underlying structure at the functional level. And that's where we want to do. So now we are using individualized connectomes from patients. And the plan is to do single subject prediction based on those tracks between regions. And like to correlate with other clinical features. And typically, that was in the conclusion of the paper at that time, but it took me 7 years to learn GTI on the side. So now we are running on patients also. So we take the GTI of patients with autism, and Mata, I don't know if she's there, but Mata is working on that currently. And we are trying to show that having the anatomical structure is one thing, but if you use the anatomical structure and you start simulating resting state or interpersonal interaction, you may boost your predictability of diagnosis on typically autism. This is preliminary, but it's like in the digital twin kind of spirit.
Nice, thank you.
Hi, Guillaume.
Hi.
Very nice presentation as usual. Quick question, you briefly mentioned your paper on the modeling consciousness, and you said, well, you want to model access consciousness and not necessarily phenomenological consciousness. Can you just detail a bit how you get to that, how you can model one more than the other, just for the sake of...
Yeah, sure. So yeah, from a pragmatic perspective, I don't know if all of you are really in consciousness research, but there is a lot of debate about even the definition of consciousness. And a very pragmatic take is to assume that from a behavioral perspective, consciousness is just the ability to report, to have perceived something. So like access consciousness. And there is another form of consciousness that is more like subjectively the feeling of it, like it's NetBlock, yeah, wrote in what is like to be a bat, yeah. And I'm always convinced it's NetBlock, or is it?
What is like it to be a bat is not NetBlock.
Oh, so it's who is that?
Yeah,
It's
Thomas Nagel.
Thomas Nagel. Yeah, thank you.
But access consciousness and phenomenological consciousness
Yeah,
is
so
NetBlock's taxonomy.
Well, anyway, so it's a good paper. What is like to be a bat? But anyway, so come back to the phenomenal consciousness. This part is more mysterious. It has a lot of problem regarding demonstration, and that's why actually my Twitter handle is introspection, because it's a nag for the fact that a lot of people think that introspectionism was a mess, and it was a loss of energy for the scientific research to try to introspect about consciousness. But now we have more principle-based and computational methods to approach this subjective aspect of consciousness. There is another paper I didn't mention with Mila on the ineffability and richness of consciousness that try to reconcile actually those two things even. But for the access consciousness, so the ability to report, here we assume that the first level to secure was to have a perceptual, stable representation of the world. So the first foundation of the model is how you get the visual cortex, basically identifying stable representation. Then you have a second step that is you need to combine those representation together. So, and here the necessary condition for that was reinforcement learning. So like the first one need only Hebbian learning. You don't need necessarily dopamine and reinforcement learning to get stable statistical representation. You need just Hebbian learning. But at the level when you need to combine them in a task-oriented fashion, then you need reinforcement learning. And the last step for access consciousness, you need to be able to hold a conscious representation, even if there is no more stimulus outside. So it's like working memory, basically. And there's a lot of discussion also between, is access consciousness actually just working memory? From a functional perspective, it looks like that a lot. And here we need interneuron and inhibitory to be able to stabilize this kind of representation without having a stimulation from the external world. So that's like the 3 steps. Yeah.
It is a very good answer. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. I have a question about some of your work with autism. I was just wondering, are you able to find like a reliable sort of activation map or network that represents joint attention in typical development and in autism, I guess, as well?
Yeah. So on that, I never studied directly joint attention. We are starting hyperscanning recordings with autistic individuals. So we may know more next time. But on that, I didn't have time to elaborate more, but something that is interesting when you start to have this dyadic and interpersonal account of autism is that you have more to deal with what people call the double empathy problem. Yeah. And the fact that autism has been reified at one single brain problem and tend to marginalize people with autism and seeing them as with like a brain that is broken and so on. Like I spend a lot of time to debunk, for instance, the broken mirror theory that autistic had a broken mirror system. This is bullshit, actually. But if you have interpersonal relationship and you understand that social interaction is not only happen in the brain, but is a dyadic process, then neurotypical have also a problem to interact with autistic individuals. And so like, that's what the double empathy problem is. And in this simulation of two brains, we show that having the same topology potentiates your ability to synchronize. So to follow up on your question, but you can have also neurodiverse topology similar and have less impairment. So it's more like when your two type of topology are too different that you may encounter a problem of synchronization. Mm-hmm. And so it's not necessarily, I think like the field of autism is pretty much showing how it's a mess, like a lack of reproducibility and so on. So I start to really doubt that there is a single social function in the brain or even function that is altered in autistic individuals, but maybe they are more part of a large diversity of what the brain can be, and thus through development end up having problems to synchronize and develop a normal cognition at the social level. Yeah.
Thank you.
For the sake of time, I think we'll have to wrap it up there.
Okay.
But thanks for the lovely talk and discussion, Professor Dumas.
Thank you.